Hello, beautiful people. I hope you're all having a fantastic day so far. Today, I want to talk about why the government is in so much debt and how it's affecting all of us. And it's a topic that I'm excited to talk about because last night I decided to just go down the rabbit hole and really understand what kind of like makes this economy tick, what makes global economies tick. And of course, there's a whole multitude of factors. But I was watching a documentary by the Financial Times, and it was talking to the fact that I think the title was centered around why are governments addicted to debt. I was like, interesting. Now, they were speaking, I had no clue of what they were talking about. But then I spent some time to break it down. And what it led me to was understanding why governments borrow money. So I'm going to use the UK as an example because it's the best example I can think of because I live here. So, in times and situations of stress, of turmoil, for innovation, for opportunities, typically the government decides to essentially raise money, raise capital, like a business owner would or a startup would, in order to fund certain endeavors, especially if it's for, let's say, something innovative. But in some situations, you just need help. In situations where, let's say, for example, you've got something to do or achieve, but you don't have the funds, you may get some money from the bank, whether through a credit card, loan, whatever it may be. And so the way it does this is that it issues these things called bonds. In the UK, they're known as gilts. And essentially, they're called gilts in the UK because of the way they looked and the way they were designed back in the day. Okay. Now, essentially, a bond. I'm going to use bond because that's more universally known and understood. But these bonds are essentially a contract, okay, or an IOU. Okay, so this contract essentially is sold to organizations, private organizations that have the money to buy these bonds. So let's say, for example, the UK wants to build some new roads because there are loads of potholes and they need 100 million raised in total. They will sell these gilts or bonds, okay? Same thing, just remember gilts in the UK, but bonds is the more universal term, in order to raise that money. So what ends up happening is that's almost like a distress signal, okay? To say, we need money, we need help. Who is willing in the market to essentially buy these bonds? And so, with that in mind, you've got private investors, hedge funders, insurance companies, pension companies who transact and manage all this big amount, billions of pounds and dollars worth of money. And they buy these bonds as a form of security. Why? Well, if we look back at history, especially with how bonds work, they're seen as reliable and stable. Now, I have to explain why they are seen as reliable and stable. Now, once that transaction happens in terms of the private investors buying these bonds, they're basically lending money to, let's say, the UK as an example. They're lending this money. And so through lending that money, there is interest applied to that. So you got the standard interest rate for whatever it is for that country or for that central bank. So let's say, for example, it's at 3%. And then they may have a yield on top of that. So the yield is the additional that is made for that, let's say, private organization, private investor, etc., etc. And so the government now has to pay back what they were originally given. So let's say this £100 million in addition to interest, which may be 4%. So the core interest rate in addition to that yield number. So let's say it's 4%. Okay. Now these contracts may run for like, let's say 10 years. And so the expectation is that the interest rate, so 4% on top of the 100 million, is paid back every single year. So let's just be clear. The 4% is paid every year. And then the principal amount, the original amount, the 100 million, is also paid back. So 4% of 100 million is 4 million. So 4 million would be paid every single year. Okay. Then the 100 million on top of that. So that would be 140 million in total. And so because the UK, as an example, has never defaulted on payments ever, they're seen as reliable because they're needed, so to speak. Now, the interest paid on top are known as promises. Okay, so you promise to pay 4% each year, and these are known as coupons, so to speak. So I'm just giving you the language that is used. And so these private investors can use this money to essentially sort of like protect against sort of like hedges and all of that kind of stuff there, especially if they're dealing with, you know, millionaires and billionaires money, or people's pensions or people's insurance. They want to make sure they've got something that they're hedging against that is seen as safe and secure, etc., etc. So that's one side. That is one side of it. Now you may think to yourself, why do private investors even buy bonds? Well, I've just spoken about the securities aspect, and it's seen as secure and they can make money back, but it's not exciting money. And that's the whole point. It's deemed to be seen as not a guaranteed return, but you're most likely going to get a return. But in addition to that, there may be a strategic angle here. Okay. So for example, if a private investor or even another country, another central bank from another country rates another country, okay, they may want to see that country do well. And so they may buy bonds from that specific country. It may be seen as potential leverage or power steering, potentially, because again, you've got some high players in the game who are paying for specific types of bonds or whatever it may be to potentially, again, push certain, I don't know, projects or implementations. Now, of course, I don't know whether they know what they're funding, and that could probably be found out on, I think it's the House of Commons website or the government website or whatever it may be. But of course, this would be in the plans and reports. But again, they would have some steer to a degree, just because they have the money, so to speak. Now, the UK, I believe, started to really get into this whole space of, you know, borrowing and all this kind of stuff even more so. I think especially from 2009 onwards, after the financial crash. But I'll talk about that in a bit more detail. But I just want you to understand this is the first part that I want to talk to, okay? The first part being that private investors, hedge funders, insurance companies, pension companies, those are examples, of course, essentially buy these bonds, helping the UK government out. Now, sometimes a country can get into a doom loop, okay, where essentially they're like, oh gosh, we can't pay back the money. We need to borrow more. And of course, happily, the investors would be like, yeah, I'm happy to give you more money. You know the deal. Give me my 4% each year, and that will be that. And it just keeps on happening again and again and again and again and again. To the point where it becomes very difficult for the country to actually raise money for the things that they want to raise it for. So let me give you an example. As of March 2023, I want to say, and again, fact check everything that I'm saying, please, because don't take this as gospel. I'm just telling you what I've learnt, and then for those boffins or experts who know better, you can correct me in the comments, okay? Or do your own video. But as of March 2023, I believe the sort of national debt within the UK was roughly 2.6 trillion. And we know that, you know, when it comes to what the government can spend is roughly 1.2 trillion. So it's double. It's 100.5% more. So what does that mean? It means that we got a lot of debt to pay back. And so this kind of comes back to the whole fiscal rules thing, i.e. financial rules in terms of how we manage our money, that was declared by Rachel Reeves in October 2024. And so what she is trying to do is ensure that any sort of like taxes, revenue from taxes is being used to pay back this debt, in addition to other things here and there. So a measly 40 billion from national insurance and all this kind of stuff there really doesn't make a dent. Probably not, but over time, maybe. Who knows? There is an argument to be said that actually we need to be using that money for more innovative practices. But the truth is, the way this works is you are paying the interest back first. The government is paying the interest back first. So that interest, a lot of, you know, what we're spending our money on is paying back interest on the bonds that were sold to these different private organizations. So let's hold that thought for now. Let's move into another situation. So some of you may be aware of this whole idea of quantitative easing. And this started in, I think it was March, well, I don't know the actual month, but 2009, after the financial crisis. And quantitative easing is essentially the process at which the central bank, the Bank of England, prints money. Okay. And so why do they do this? Well, they can't just print money. Okay. That goes against all terms. But what they can do is essentially buy back the bonds that were sold via the private investors back into the UK hands, as an example. They buy them back. And so in order to buy them back, what they do is they print money. And when I say print money, this is just a digital process. Okay, so they type in a number, it literally generates money out of thin air, and then they use that to buy back those bonds, okay, which are called gilts within the UK, but I'm just going to say bonds. And so what ends up happening is that they buy them back from what is known as the second market, or the secondary market, okay? It's not the original market, but the secondary market. And so these private investors will get these, will sell their bonds, get money back, okay? And then the contract changes. Because remember, I said a bond is an IOU. It's a contract, it's an agreement, so to speak. So it's no longer owned by the private investor, okay, or the hedge fund, or the business, or the pension company, or the insurance company. It's now owned by the Bank of England, the central bank, our central bank. And so it's changed. And so what ends up happening is that the UK government, okay, the UK government are not now paying that hedge funder. They're now paying the central bank, the Bank of England. But because the central bank and the government are the same, state-owned, okay, it's public sector, there is no interest that is being paid, okay, so additional yield, should we say, to the Bank of England. Because remember, you've got the government who are now paying the private organization or private company, private investors. But now because the central bank and the private investors did their own transaction, and the central bank bought from the private organization, they now have to, the government now have to pay interest to the central bank. Hopefully that makes sense, because that took me a long time to work out. Hopefully I've got that right. But because the central bank, the Bank of England, is not trying to make money off their own government, what ends up happening is that interest rate is essentially passed through to the treasury, okay? So those promises, I want to say, or coupons. And so essentially what ends up happening is that there is a bit of an admin exercise that happens. So therefore, no additional monies is really being sort of like paid to, I guess, some external entity, okay? It's all in-house. And so obviously these things need to be tracked to make sure that they're not doing anything illegal, or that isn't, I don't know if constitutional would be the right word, legislative, I don't know. The point being made is they balance the books, okay? And so that process is happening again and again and again. And now that only works really well in a low inflationary environment, okay? Which means that in an environment where there is low interest, not high interest, okay? And so if you have high interest, what ends up happening is that the government has to pay more, which provides more pressure. Now let's get back to it. So we're in a situation where all of this stuff has happened. Now, there will be instances where, again, because money has been printed, okay, or has been developed and put into the system, it means that there is more money in the supply, okay? There's more money floating about. So remember when, again, the central bank bought those bonds back, or whatever it may be, those private investors use that money, okay, to essentially invest in, let's say, business endeavors, provide, credit and or loans to people buying houses or for buying different stuff that they want to buy, etc., etc. They're doing all this different stuff. And so they're generating activity into the system. There's more money. So people feel like, oh yeah, I can do this, that, all this kind of stuff there. And so what ends up happening is that people get more confident to buy, which means demand goes up for products and services. And as demand goes up for products and services, those people who supply the products and services are under pressure to provide value, whatever that value looks like. This could look like houses. This could look like watches, cars, whatever it may be. So as there is high demand, the supply gets not squeezed but pressurized. And to manage that pressure, they may increase prices. So this is where the inflation comes into play. So prices start to rise in order to manage buying behavior. Of course, in some instances, it can rise so much where inflation is really high, it's beyond the 2% target, okay, which is what governments like, or central banks may do this on purpose in order to make sure that, again, there is some level of control in terms of spending, because we're seen as fiscally sensible or financially sensible. Fiscal is just the word that the government uses in politics and stuff. Now, the reverse of quantitative easing is quantitative tightening, where rather than buying the bonds back from the investors, what the central bank will do is sell the bonds in order to release money, okay? Or not even release money, to soak up the money, and so it's not back in the supply again. And that's essentially how you sort of manage and control the money. It's just the opposite way. Why am I saying all of this stuff? Because this is a lot of stuff. Okay. I say this to say, and before I even say that, I want to highlight this point as well because it's in my notes. So I've spoken about more money flows into the economy, more money plus same supply equals rising demand, spoke about all of that stuff. So lower interest rates compound the effect. So quantitative easing pushes bond prices up, which means yields, interest rates go down. Okay, so there's that, which means lower interest rates means cheaper borrowing, more mortgages, and more business loans. So hopefully that part made sense. Obviously, as prices go up and I want to explain that part because what I said was that as quantitative easing happens and the central bank obviously prints digital money and it buys back its bonds and all this kind of stuff there, it puts money into the system based on the reasons I said before, which is really centered around the fact that these hedge funders use it for different stuff. More money flows into the system, which means that because there is higher demand, the sort of like gilt prices go up, okay, to manage sort of supply and demand, and the interest rates go down in that sense. This is for the bonds specifically, the yields element. And so again, this affects buying behavior. So I'm saying this to say, okay, that essentially our government, okay, or governments across the world are beholden to these different bond purchases. What the Financial Times called, I think it was bond vigilantes. Okay. So individuals who are, I say individuals, organizations or firms or whatever it may be, that are controlling the rate at which people have to pay back these bonds or whatever it may be, i.e. the UK, US governments, all this kind of stuff there. Which means they're controlling behavior, they're controlling the narrative. And of course, the original reasons for why these different bonds were sold in the first place by the UK government, or gilts, is to support things. So COVID is a great example. World War II, the financial crisis of 2008, and COVID were the three most highest times in which bonds were sold to these different sort of like private investors. And I think COVID was one of the first times, one of the few times where corporate bonds were also involved in this space, which is interesting because they don't have the same level of I'm assuming there is a different sort of like regulation and approach in relation to what the terms and conditions are for corporate bonds. We can only imagine. So For the conspiracy theorist, they may suggest that actually, well, we're, follow the money and then you'll understand why things are being controlled and stuff. Whereas for the other person, they may say, well, it's not necessarily about control, it's about honoring the payments. And that's just how life is. You just have to pay this stuff back. But when we think about it, World War II, of course, how is that funded? Through debt. Who financed that debt? Private investors. So again, if you follow it, it kind of defines like the movement and how things work. And so if we come back to it, can you control the events of economic, socio-economic, and geopolitical factors? Yes, to a degree you can. But physical effects, changes to technology, that can be controlled, but we are in evolving times either way. So I say this to bring awareness to you, okay? For you to either go on and do your own research to understand it fully in the way that you need to understand it, and or understand why we are in the conditions we're in right now. The government's hands are tied. They are tied. And yes, they can make changes. And yes, there's an argument to be said that they can keep on printing money, but that is dangerous and difficult based on the rules that they have, given the fact that inflation could increase, interest rates could increase, all of this kind of stuff there. And at the rate at which they're borrowing money is insane, which kind of shows that the infrastructure, the original infrastructure that was set up, was not set up properly. Things were ignored. Money could have been invested into other innovative, educational, cultural things that prepares the country for success and growth moving forward. But of course, we couldn't have predicted, well, some people may say, yes, we could have, but we couldn't have predicted COVID, energy crises. To a degree, we could have, especially with the war in Ukraine and Russia. So how does this come back to you as an individual? You can follow the bond markets to understand precisely what is happening. When we think about what happened with Liz Truss, she was looking to create some sort of freer market and create entrepreneurial endeavors, so to speak. The Bank of England and private investors, or whoever it may be, I don't know, I'm not pinning it on one person, but whoever owned the bond said, that's not happening. And just essentially sold them to basically crash the market. To basically show that we don't have a vote in confidence in what you're proposing, whether it was going to work or not. Okay, I know people are saying, oh, it was crazy anyway. But there are some passionate people out there who are like, no, it could have worked if we tried it. I mean, there's for and against. Anywho, so that's an example of what you can see. And so you'll see conservative governments after that, and obviously this current Labour government wanting to avoid that stuff. And this is why you see these fiscal rules and all. They'd rather make cuts and changes to making the government lean and stuff, and people say that's a good idea anyway, then obviously lean into other endeavors. And I'm not saying taxes, but that's part of the reasons why they're doing this stuff, because they need to pay back these people who initially bought these bonds and have these terms and conditions as IOUs, promises, or coupons. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea. It's different to what I usually talk about, but I think this understanding gives you empowerment, really, so that the conversation becomes clearer, so that when you're understanding political policy, what people are saying versus what they're doing, it gives you more strength. How are they going to tackle that problem? And how does that relate to dealing with labor markets, dealing with innovation within the country, dealing with wealth and income and health inequalities? It all links. How are you going to manage this stuff, given that you know this information or are reminded of this information or going to research this information more? Are you going to rely and wait on the government to make some changes, or is there something that you can do to either spread awareness or at least change the destination of your community, your family, whatever it may be, whatever side of the coin you fit on, because everyone's different, of course. So yeah, hopefully you enjoyed that. Of course, if you want to sort of like keep in touch with some of the stuff I'm talking about and stuff, of course, subscribe to this channel. Make sure you do. But you can also check out my newsletter where I talk about Again, this whole idea of the consultant mindset and how you can develop a strong portfolio career in these common socio-economic times that are proving to be challenging for many. If you want to see more videos centered around portfolio careers, anything centered around consulting, all of that kind of stuff there independently, then don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And as always, my friends, understand, reach, and expand. Peace.